Imagine being treated as a suspect for simply walking near the scene of a crime. That's the reality of a mass warrantless surveillance tool known as a geofence warrant. And in this episode, I'm going to break down what they are, how often they've been used, and a surprising twist, some really positive pushback against them by, of all people, Google. But first of all, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, May 22nd, 2024. I want to kick this off with a new article we just published by Mike Meharry, The Dragnet State, How Geofence Warrants Turn Everyone into a Suspect. And he writes, imagine drawing a box on a map and declaring that every person who was within that area during a given time is a suspect in a crime. That is the effect of a surveillance tool called a geofence warrant. They literally just pull up a map, they draw on there, electronically, of course, and everyone who had a phone that went through that area, any type of electronic device that pings location data through a certain period. It could be 6 hours, it could be 30 minutes, it could be 24 hours, weeks, whatever they decide to do. The data is stored for years and years and years and shared all over the place. I'll get to all that in just a moment. But Mike says, in practice, a geofence warrant allows law enforcement agencies, federal, state, and local, to require big tech companies like Google to disclose every electronic device within a given area at a given time. This is not a warrant based on probable cause, or particularly describing the person, place, or thing to be searched or seized. It is what is known as a general warrant that includes anyone in a given area at a given time. It is part of the reason that there was an American Revolution to oppose that type of thing. But here we have some examples, and I don't want to just go through all the horrible ways that law enforcement, federal, state, and local have destroyed people's lives through this thing, but just a couple of interesting examples. Here from Jonathan Hofer at Independent Institute, he writes that in 2020, 23-year-old Jorge Molina was arrested in Avondale, Arizona, and charged with murder, serious business. Molina knew he was innocent, but during what he would later characterize as a nightmare scenario, police insisted that they had their suspect during his interrogation. According to the police, his phone was, quote, without a doubt at the crime scene. But unbeknownst to Molina at this time, detectives arrested him based on Google location data obtained through a geofence warrant, and because surveillance footage showed a white Honda registered to him near the crime. So I would see that he could be a suspect, but if you get the wrong information through this geolocation stuff, and maybe you can say, oh, we caught a criminal, but look at how sometimes this stuff fails as well. Of course, we don't want to argue just utilitarian. Did we get the bad guys? Then it's okay. They can do whatever they want. Certainly, that's not the position that we're taking here today. But this is an interesting example. Here from the Phoenix New Times, Meg O'Connor writes, first they questioned him about the white Honda. He said he owned one, but get this, his stepfather, a man with a history of violence and a warrant out for him in California, often drove it without his permission. So maybe they could have picked up somebody else instead. They asked him who had access to his phone and Google account. Then they asked him if he had murdered a man named Joseph Knight. Molina was in shock. He said, I didn't shoot anybody. I'm not that type of person. I would never do anything like that. And that's according to the police report. And the police put it this way, also in the police report, I told Jorge that we knew 100% without a doubt that his phone was at the shooting scene. So this turns out to be an error. They weren't 100% sure that his phone was there. They had wrong information from this geofence warrant from Google. It's not always exact. And if you want to read all the details of how it fell apart, I think it's very interesting to see how they could make errors with this stuff. You can read this whole story. It'll be linked to in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. But the really sad part is he ended up being in jail for like 6 days. They put him in a really bad one, not a friendly one. He ended up losing his job. It was very public what happened. He lost his job while he was in jail. He had his car impounded. It created this domino effect that really impacted his life. Bad stuff. Here's another example. NBC News reports that a man in Gainesville, Florida in 2020 became a suspect because his bike route to work had him pass a house that was once burglarized. And that's the title of the article. Google tracked his bike ride past a burglarized home. That made him a suspect. Merely for going past a location where a crime was committed means you were a suspect in the crime. Now, EFF puts it this way. Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF.org, one of the best organizations, if not the best, on privacy and surveillance issues. They've covered geofence warrants for quite some time. These reverse warrants, that's the actual term for them, have serious implications for civil liberties. Their increasingly common use means that anyone who commutes, whose commute takes them by the scene of a crime might suddenly become vulnerable to suspicion, surveillance, and harassment by police. We know they've also used this to track everyone at a protest. It says, they write, it also means that with one document, all they do is issue this geofence warrant to the tech company and say, we want everyone in this location from these times around this particular boundary. It also means that with one document, companies would be compelled to turn over identifying information on every phone that appeared in the vicinity of a protest, like what happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin, during a protest a few years ago as well. Jake Snow at ACLU Northern California, they did a lot of in-depth analysis of how these have been used in San Francisco and throughout California. They use them a lot here in California, more than any other state. Surprise, surprise. And they point out, Jake writes, geofence warrants are by nature massively overbroad. They are not particularly describing the person or place to be searched or seized, and they're just searching everybody and tracking everybody. Law enforcement may be interested in a single suspect, he writes, and in trying to identify them, request a geofence warrant that covers blocks of homes, offices, and other private spaces. For example, a single warrant we analyzed in San Francisco's Bret Harte neighborhood captured 4 places of worship, including Cornerstone Missionary Baptist and Evergreen Baptist Church. I believe, and I couldn't find the article as I was prepping my notes for this yesterday, but I believe they actually used this during the lockdown regime in San Jose. People were going to a church, and so then they just drew on the map, and then they issued the geofence warrant, and they knew everybody who went to that place. When they weren't supposed to. It was illegal to go to a church at a particular time. And if we saw how they did it last time, we shouldn't be surprised when this type of thing happens again. And they've really practiced and ramped up with these types of tools to make it far more dystopian than what we've already experienced. That's just the nature of how government goes. So we know they will track people who go to a church as well. If you went to one of these churches, he writes, during a window in which a geofence warrant was issued, law enforcement could have discovered where you were and who you were with. I mean, what kind of profiles are they already building on people? Who you interact with, what stores you go with, where you shop, where you travel, where you worship, what you purchase, because they know you went to a gun shop, for example. They know these types of things as well. Meharry points out that geofence warrants also run afoul of the Fourth Amendment, and I would also add we should really emphasize the state constitutions as well, not just the federal Bill of Rights. Certainly that applies to the federal government, but there are very restrictive measures in state constitutions as well. But because they require no probable cause, EFF put it like this: the only evidence supporting a geofence warrant, and they put evidence in scare quotes, is that a crime occurred in a particular area and the perpetrator likely carried a cell phone that shared location data with Google. That is not probable cause for them to search anybody. Geofence warrants, Mike points out, are eerily similar to general warrants issued by the British in colonial America. Again, this was one of the reasons. This was kind of the kickoff of the American Revolution, the writs of assistance. Mike writes, they allowed government agents to enter private homes and businesses to search for evidence of smuggling. John Hancock and others, of course. Much like geofence and keyword warrants today, general warrants did not specify the place to be searched, nor limit what these government agents could search for. They were just broad, and they were general warrants. Now, James Otis Jr., in February of 1761, he gave this 4-5-hour, he just railed against the writs of assistance in this very, very important speech, which John Adams years later many times referred to as the birth of the American Revolution. Then and there, he said, the child independence was born. Because if we understand the American Revolution as being the radical change in the viewpoints of the people for the period of about 15 years before the shot heard round the world at Lexington and Concord, this is where many people, at least, looked at the beginning of the revolution was James Otis Jr.'s fiery speech against the writs of assistance, where he pointed out that an act against the Constitution is void. He also pointed out that a man's home is his castle, things like this. You could only have special warrants that particularly describe these things, a precursor to the Fourth Amendment. They couldn't just search whatever they want, whenever they want, because when you give government that kind of power, they are certainly going to use it. And Otis called a general warrant the worst instrument of arbitrary power. He said the most destructive of English liberty and the fundamental principles of law that ever was found in an English law book. I mean, if that isn't saying quite a bit, I don't know what is. But I covered Otis's great speech in some detail in an episode a few years ago now, The Real Revolution, James Otis versus the Writs of Assistance. That will be in the show notes. Now, according to Google, they actually published a supplemental doc on this sometime in 2020 or early 2021, supplemental information on geofence warrants in the United States. They're not fans of this thing. We'd think that they'd be all on board, and I'm kind of surprised. Wait till we get a little bit later in the show here. This really interesting twist from Google. The first geofence warrants, according to Google, came to them from federal agents in 2016, probably the FBI, the Department of Justice. And it expanded pretty fast from there to go to the states in the following years as well. And in 2020, 2021, they issued this fact sheet on their use. They revealed that geofence warrants constituted more than 25%. So these, just draw on a map, tell us everybody was where they were and who was there when in this location. It could be for 1 hour, 24 hours, weeks. It doesn't matter. Whatever the government tells them to do. Of course, they're complying wherever they're told to, I would think. Otherwise, they're going to get shut down. I can see why they do it. But they do have an interesting approach to blocking the government on this that I think we should absolutely applaud, that I'll get to in a few minutes. But by 2020, a quarter of all warrant requests that came to Google, and mind you, there are a lot that go to Google, 25% of them were geofence warrants. This is pretty significant. California, surprise, surprise, requested far more than any other state. They're really bad here. And in most situations, Google is actually given gag orders. They can't tell anybody about this. They can't, tell anybody that they're being followed for at least months after the fact. Now, this is going to be linked to in the show notes, just like all the other articles, source documents, etc. Of course, that Google Doc I think is very interesting. That's over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Alan Mosley will get that blog post organized. There's a show link section where that'll all be included. Plus, he includes all the links to all the different platforms we live stream on or archive, the audio version, the podcast edition, the video platforms. We live stream, of course, on YouTube and X and LinkedIn and Twitch and Facebook. We also live stream over at rumble.com, odyssey.com, where we get some of the best feedback as well, plus on YouTube as well. And then the audio only, the podcast edition, Apple, Spotify, Podbean, elsewhere. If we're missing from one of the platforms that you prefer to listen or watch on, please do let me know either in the comments or email team@10thamendmentcenter.com. So we will have this published in the next couple of hours after this live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I've actually got some workers coming over here in a little bit, so I'm going to have to skip over the live chat here this morning, but I will read through some of the comments a little bit later today, and I really appreciate all your feedback because I get tons of ideas for future episodes from your comments. Anyways, let's get back to it. So by 2020, Google's getting 25% of all their search warrant requests are geofence warrants. Very significant. This is just from 2016. It didn't really ramp up until 2018, so just over a handful of years. This is one of the primary ways government is searching for, stuff. And Meharry says this is what they stored in. A massive Google database known as Sensor Vault holds detailed location of at least, quote, hundreds of millions of devices worldwide, dating back nearly a decade. This is according to Google employees that were interviewed by the New York Times. So hundreds of millions of devices, all the location data that they've ever pinged out to cell towers or anything else over a decade. This is an incredible amount of information. EFF puts it this way. The data that Google turns over to law enforcement is so precise that one deputy police chief said, quote, "It shows the whole pattern of life." During the Snowden leaks, during that time, 2013, 2014, there was a lot of discussion about how metadata can really help them paint a picture of who a person is, what they do. I mean, if you ever shopped on one of these big platforms like Amazon or something like that, and you put something in your shopping cart and they say, "Oh, you might also be interested in this." And a lot of times they're right. Sometimes they're way off. But this is the kind of data they collect. They know if you do one thing, the odds are something else is coming up. It's not just a predictive algorithm, but they're also looking at all of your activity over a decade or longer. And think of how bad this is going to be in 30, 40 years when people are growing up, their whole life is being tracked and traced. It shows the whole pattern of life. EFF says it's collected even when the people aren't making calls or using apps, which means it can be even more detailed than data generated by cell towers. We might be aware of something called a cell site simulator. This is also called a Stingray. That's the Harris Corporation version of it. It was an actual box. Now it's mostly software. And what this does is it spoofs a cell phone tower. So if they've got a laptop sitting in a police vehicle or a government agent of any type, they're spoofing a cell phone tower, and all the phones in a location within range of that tower first connect to the Stingray device, the cell site simulator, and it seamlessly patches off to the cell tower. So if you're making a call or whatever, you don't even realize it's happening, but they're collecting all this data on you, your location, etc. But the geofence warrants collect even more data than just what's being sent back and forth to a tower or through a cell site simulator. This is very powerful stuff. Now, one Google employee at some point said that the company received as many as 180 requests for location information in a single week. So they're getting a lot of these. And ACLU, Chad Marlowe and Jennifer Granick at ACLU point out that the number of reverse location warrants received from the federal government. So first, again, remember, the feds started in 2016. And then we really only have data on it that at least that Google was sharing from 2018 on. But the requests received from the federal government grew by 1,171% between 2018 and 2020. While the number of reverse location warrants issued to Google by state and local law enforcement grew by 813% in California, 901% in Florida. I'll say 1,300% in Michigan, 1,900% in Missouri, 33% in Massachusetts during that same time period. Now, California does easily the most of these. So even though other states have been catching up and really ramping up their use of this, California kicked it off. Now, we've seen this happen on a lot of bad things over the years, so we shouldn't be surprised at that at all. Anyways, Jake Snow points out in his research, this is them analyzing how it's being used in California, because if we see it spreading to other places, we shouldn't be surprised when they do the same types of things that these status pigs here in California do. He said, we conducted a high-level analysis of the types of places. This is from like 2018 through 2021. The types of places captured by law enforcement in geofence warrants across San Francisco. Note that this list only includes sites within or immediately bordering the area of a reverse location search. They aren't going beyond that. So they're whatever's showing up, they say people in transit, or simply walking down the street, could also have been swept up in the police dragnet surveillance. Even people in the presumed privacy of their own home. A man's home is his castle, according to James Otis Jr., part of the beginning of the American Revolution. No longer. The privacy of your own home could have been located and monitored by law enforcement. So hundreds of places where people live. They found that 121 homes and 82 apartment buildings were covered by these geofence warrants over that period. This is just in San Francisco over a 3-year period. 84 places where people work, including Oracle, ACOM, law firms, investment services like New Island Capital Management, Horizon Foundation, nonprofit organization, architecture firms. So they're really covering lots of stuff with lots of people. 32 different bars and restaurants, 12 places of worship, medical sites, grocery stores, etc. So if you want to read through all the details of that analysis, see how they've used it in California so you're prepared for how they'll probably try to use it against you in your state, follow the bad guy leader type of thing. This is really interesting stuff. Of course, that'll be linked to in the show notes. Now, there's even a company that has popped up with an annual subscription service. It's pretty cheap too, maybe like $500 or less. I can't remember what the pricing is. They offer a free trial. You can see it up here on the screen, called warrantbuilder.com. They assist law enforcement agencies in drawing up geofence warrant paperwork that kind of fits within the federal court opinions that have basically given this legal cover for them to be able to do more and more. And we see how quickly it's ramping up. Warrantbuilder.com. This is not a sponsored post, but Meharry puts it like this. Once collected, and this is, I think, probably one of the worst parts of this that no one even thinks about, really. We always point out the data sharing end of this type of thing. Once collected on a local level, a federal level, a state level, doesn't matter. Once they collect it at one level, it is shared everywhere. The data is almost certainly shared with other law enforcement agencies. That's an understatement. Federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies can share and tap into vast amounts of information gathered at the state and local level or on the federal level through fusion centers and a system known as the Information Sharing Environment, ISE. This came out of the Patriot Act and the aftermath of that. In other words, Mike writes, surveillance like this, even on a local level, will also create the potential for the federal government to track the movement of millions of Americans with no warrant, no probable cause, and without the people even knowing about it. And we know that the federal government has absolutely done this exact type of thing with another surveillance tool called automated license plate readers, ALPRs. The DEA, which shouldn't exist, the only thing it's authorized to do under the Constitution, just like their buddies at the ATF, is disband. But, setting that aside, what they did, we found out 8 years in, once there were some documents leaked, now I think it's like 10, 11, or 12 years, 8 years they had been running a location tracking system through data collected on a state or local level on these red light cameras or automated license plate readers that can be set up at the entrance to a parking lot, a grocery store. They're on telephone poles, on the tops of cop cars, etc. They just snap pictures of 800,000 cars per minute. And they store the information, share it through fusion centers, and then, of course, then it's accessed by the DEA, the ATF, etc. And they were building profiles on the movement of people for years and years. And I'm sure they're still doing it, but primarily they weren't setting up the system. They were relying on the locals to do the surveillance. That's why when the locals do surveillance, because of this network of sharing, it really is a national surveillance tool. So we don't have any specific data on the sharing of geofence warrants, partly because it's so new and partly because we generally find out how they've been sharing it many years later and how bad it is. So it's good that this information is actually getting out there as early as possible on this. But we do know that with the automated license plate readers, once a local law enforcement agency has collected and stored data on somebody, they share it with a minimum of 160 other government agencies on a local, state, and federal level. So if you go through a red light camera, I always use Boise, Idaho as an example of this. I just think of a nice kind of small to mid-sized town. Let's say you go through a red light camera and they snap a picture of your car. Even if it's a rental, they can figure out who it is. That goes through the Fusion Center or ISC, and everybody has access to that. So you can have this data sharing all over the place. And EFF actually did some studies on this. We know that over just a 2-year period, there was like 2.5 billion license plate scans transferred all over the place. And one of the worst scenarios was one law enforcement agency shared it with 800 others. All their information was going to 800 other agents. And this was a few years ago, so it's probably significantly worse. Now, these things are so bad. And I've got a report here from TechCrunch from a couple of years ago that I think is interesting as well. We've been tracking legislation to ban the use of these on a state or a local level, just like we do with cell site simulators, warrantless facial recognition surveillance by drones, etc. But we started to see some legislation pop up in a number of states, Missouri, California, New York, not as much in the last year or so, but a couple of years ago, we saw a bunch of this where Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo, of all people, they actually came out publicly against the use of these geofence warrants. And we're actually lobbying in support of the state legislation to ban their use on a state level. I think they lobbied in support of a bill in New York. That report will be linked to in the show notes as well. But here's the surprising twist. Meanwhile, Mike Meharry writes, in December of this last year, 2023, Google announced 3 changes to the way that it handles location history that could make it impossible for the company to provide any useful information with geofence warrants. Now, they didn't specifically, I read through this again yesterday, and I don't really remember them specifically saying we're doing this to make it impossible for you to submit us a geofence warrant and for us to give you any information. But certainly we know they've been publicly against this. They've been lobbying against it. They've been trying to get state bills passed to block it. So when none of that actually played out the way I think they wanted, all the lobbying efforts stopped. So they looked at the technical end and said, well, let's create an environment where even if they do present us this geofence warrant, we won't have any data to give to them. And that to me kind of blows my mind, but it's very, very positive. But there's also another bad twist following this in just a moment. So the three things that Google did. One, location data will be stored on a user's device by default instead of in the cloud. Because if you have it on your device, rather than the cloud, they got to go to you to get the data, not to Google. And then if it's encrypted too, that's a different story. But location data will be automatically deleted after 3 months. Currently, the data is stored at least 18 months and often longer. We know that in their massive database, they have data going back 10 years, but the new stuff that they're collecting, just 3 months. That's better, not automatically awesome. If users back up their data in the cloud, Google will automatically encrypt your backed up data so no one can read it, including Google. So unless they have a key, and this is part of why the FBI, they're so horrible, has been so much after Apple, because Apple has encrypted communications. And by when you have it encrypted, if you don't have a special key, then even if they go to Apple and say, provide us this data, they can't access it. There's no way for them to read it. Now, maybe at some point, there's going to be supercomputers that can do this and break encryption, but we're not there yet, not even close. So the government hates it when these tech companies use encryption. And I think that is a signal to us. Anytime they encrypt stuff, that's a positive thing. Now, that's not saying that Google or Apple or any of these people are good guys, but certainly on this, we see some positive moves. So if the government goes to Google and say, well, we want the stuff that's in the cloud, and they're like, okay, but you're not going to be able to do anything with it because you can't break the encryption. Maybe in 100 million years using today's technology. But anyways, EFF said it is, quote, cautiously optimistic. And I'm glad that they said that because we saw some reporting on this in the last few months. It says, geofence warrants are done. They're over. There's no way to do this anymore. And EFF is cautiously optimistic. They had been pressing Google on this for quite some time to make these changes. They actually did, and that is a win. They say they're cautiously optimistic that these changes will effectively stop geofence warrants. With these policy changes, Google won't likely have access to the data requested. But there's a but. However, they said, we are not yet prepared to declare total victory. Google's collection of users' location data isn't limited to just the location history data searched in response to geofence warrants. Google collects additional location information, and when you read through this article on your own, there's a link to that to give more details. They collect additional location as well. It remains to be seen whether law enforcement will find a way to access these other stores of location data on a mass basis in the future. For now, they aren't getting it from Google, and they're taking the easy way out. But surprise, surprise, just within a couple of months, we get this report from Forbes. Quote, the Department of Justice has been forcing telecom providers like AT&T and T-Mobile to provide phone information on all customers who were in the vicinity of a crime, a Forbes review of search warrants has found. So they were first going to Google. Google's the big boy. They're providing most of the data. And then Google says, well, we're going to make it so we can't do it anymore. And so then they go right to the telecom companies. Now, the telecom companies can't get as detailed and granular information as Google, but still, these people want to sweep up as much information as possible. Their appetite is endless. We should never trust them. They're the bad guys. But anyways, that's despite, back to Forbes. So within just 2 months, this is February of 2024, Google made the changes in December of 2023. All of a sudden, DOJ is like, okay, well, we'll just go somewhere else. And this is what government does. This is despite federal agents' admissions that cell providers' location data is often inaccurate. They don't even care if it's accurate, leading privacy advocates to claim that the warrants are certain to sweep up innocent people. in major crime investigations. And Lila Barghouti over at The Markup, she points out that Google is the only tech company publicly known to release this kind of information to law enforcement, specifically in response to geofence warrants. Part of the reason is they do this kind of annual kind of transparency report where they're saying, hey, we're getting requests for these types of things. And they actually have been talking about this. I would think it's very likely that they're going to everybody. Maybe they've been going to the telecoms all along, but now that they can't get it very easily from Google, if at all, they're going to be more aggressive with everybody else. It is not clear, she writes, how many other companies do the same. Microsoft Assistant General Counsel Hassan Ali, in an email response to The Markup's request for comment, said, quote, Microsoft does not and would not be in a position to comply with any warrants seeking such information. Well, you're not really having too many people walking around with a Microsoft phone these days. But I would think that if they did, they'd be right out in front doing the same thing. Apple and Facebook, surprise, surprise, declined to comment on the record regarding the warrants and whether they have any similar data and do or do not provide it to law enforcement. So we don't even know. I would think that some of these meta apps, whether it's Instagram and Facebook, I don't know the tech end of this, but I would think that they have ways to get all kinds of data from those as well. And Facebook is seems to be very willing to hand that type of stuff over to government. At least Google, I would say, on this one. So many times they've been just off. But on this one, they're doing the right thing. But Mike Meharry points out we can't rely just on these companies to make the right choices or to make technical changes that make it difficult for government to pressure them. He says the most effective way to stop geofence and keyword warrants is to ban them at the state level. But more importantly, for people to learn how to restrict location sharing on their devices as much as possible. And we'll link to it in the show notes, but Naomi Brockwell has a really great video on this as well. At least some ways to prevent the leaking of your location data. She goes through some of the things that you can do and to keep yourself a little bit more protected. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. If you want to help us reach and teach more and more people with this kind of information, there's absolutely nothing that helps us do this work more every single day, more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. There's also annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. I'd be very grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us as a member today, or you can do a one-time donation over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Of course, if you don't have the financial means, no pressure. But again, I'd be very grateful for any consideration you can give to pitching in and helping us out. You could also help us spread the word by smashing the like button, leaving reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, comments, especially in the archive, sharing links, subscribing, getting notifications, all the stuff that you can do to interact with the platform on our videos or on our episodes certainly does help a lot. Again, I really appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you have an awesome day, and I hope to see you next time here on the path to liberty.